Hello, welcome to the Gallery 400 lecture rooms at UIC. Thank you so much for coming to our panel discussion, Is a Humanitarian a Hero or a Villain? This panel is held within the Art and Art History Department and is co-sponsored by the Global Asian Studies Department at UIC. It is funded through the Provost Graduate Research Award in relation to my research for the project No Space to Mourn. This project works on deconstructing the savior complex within transnational adoption. This panel questions the righteousness of humanitarianism and works towards understanding adoption's relationship to the act of humanitarianism. Through this panel, we hope to bring conversation around the politics of adoption and shine a light on the adoptee community. This panel will be an hour long and will end with a 30-minute Q&A. My name is Sarah White, and I go by she, her, they, and I will be both a speaker and a moderator for today. I am a transracial, transnational Chinese-American woman adoptee. I was born during a time the one-child policy was being strictly enforced in China, and I was adopted in 1998 at 21 months old. Since being adopted, I have lived in Virginia, Texas, and Chicago. I hold a BFA from the School, the Art Institute of Chicago, and I am currently getting my master's degree in studio arts at the University of Illinois at Chicago, also known as UIC, where y'all are at. I am an interdisciplinary artist who mostly works in painting and fiber, and as I piece together my identity as a transnational adoptee through making, I explore the wider social and political construct, using my own story as clues to reveal histories around human rights, international relations, and race politics. With that, I would like to introduce the other amazing panelists we have today. We have Joy Messenger, who is right over there in the middle. She uses she, they, and is a physically disabled and chronically ill queer femme Korean adoptee organizer, resource mobilizer, facilitator, poet, and writer, whose work focuses on the intersections of racial, gender, disability, immigration, reproductive, and healing justice. They are the owner and principal of Yajong Consulting and Coaching, a social change consultancy dedicated to developing and strengthening BIPOC and LGBTQ disabled migrant youth and emerging leaders, organizations, and social movements, and are studying to become a death doula and licensed funeral director. Her work, activism, and writing have appeared in a variety of media platforms and publications, including the Lit Review podcast, Good Day Chicago, Daily Dot, Lost Daughters, Common Intuitions, a poetry anthology of women celebrating women, Palettes and Quills, Stereo Visions, Looking Back, Moving Forward, Evolutionary Girls Club, and now the defunct Land of Gazillion Adoptees online magazine. And then we have Madeline Fine. They use she, hers, and they are right there, the one closest to me. And Maddie was adopted from China with her twin sister 17 years ago and has grown in the west suburbs of Chicago. She attends UIC Chicago as a GPPA medical scholar since she has been accepted to medical school through the program. Maddie is spending her undergraduate years exploring the complexities of health sciences through research and clinical care, while working as a pharmacy technician and certified nursing assistant, currently pursuing her Bachelor of Science degree in statistics, a minor in both biology and chemistry. Maddie wishes to use her knowledge to investigate and improve upon health and education disparities amongst minorities to provide better health care to her future patients and the community. Mark Haglin, who is right over there at the end, uses he, him, is a professional journalist and speaker in his professional work. He is the editor of a magazine for healthcare executives and has been a professional journalist for 40 years. In addition, he has spent more than 20 years volunteering in the transracial adoption world as a writer, public speaker, moderator of in-person online groups and gatherings around critical transracial adoption topics. In 2022, he self-published his book, Extraordinary Journey, The Lifelong Path of the Transracial Adoptee. And with that, I would like to ask the other panelists, what are your thoughts on adoption being described as an act of humanitarianism?
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm happy to start. So I'm 18, so I don't have as much of a breadth of knowledge as everyone else up here, but I'm happy to talk about my experiences so far. I understand that adoptions came about a long time ago, and at first they were very much like a humanitarianism effort. However, in the past decades, it's definitely been moving to more of a parents adopt a child because they want to have children when they actually biologically can't, or other reasons. So it's definitely been shifting away from a humanitarian aspect, in my opinion. In addition, from my family, my parents weren't looking to be good people, extraordinarily good people, or were motivated by that want. They just wanted to have kids because they weren't biologically able to. So for me, in my experience, it wasn't an act of humanitarianism, but I'm happy to hear what you guys have to say about it.
Thank you. Before I speak, I just wanted to share, I had thought this was going to be a masks required event, and so if folks are able to put masks on, that way I'll feel safer taking my mask off, so you'll be able to understand me more clearly. Does everybody have a mask?
No, it's a pouch of a lot of random stuff like hand sanitizer. Apparently I have floss. You never know when you need a rubber band either.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for supporting disability access in that way. So, like Sarah had said, my name is Joy. I was adopted from Korea, from the south of Korea in the early 80s. And when I think about adoption being described as an act of, oh, there is a box of masks, thank you. When I think of adoption being described as an act of humanitarianism, I get really angry about that. So the history, is it okay if I share a little bit? Okay. We were figuring out which one of us was going to go first, would share the history of Korean adoption. But so international adoption, what's also known as transnational adoption or intra-country adoption, was started kind of as a global phenomenon in the mid-50s. There was a couple named Harry and Bertha Holt. They were Christian missionaries who were in Korea following the most active part of the war in the early to mid-50s, and they saw it as their Christian duty to adopt children who had either been orphaned by that most active part of the Korean conflict, or who had been birthed by Korean mothers who had been impregnated, whether consensually or non-consensually, by non-Korean soldier fathers. And so this was a way for Korea to kind of rid itself of both these orphan children as well as a lot of mixed race children. Korea as a culture is a place where it's very kind of mono-ethnic, like Koreans believe that there's only one ethnicity, as opposed to other East Asian countries, which have a wide array of different ethnic groups within China or Japan, for instance. We know that that is, those ideas about purity are very fraught in many ways. So when I hear adoption being described as humanitarian, I think back on that history. And I think back on Harry and Bertha Holt kind of coming back to the US and lobbying the government to change immigration policy so that they could remove Korean children from their culture and from their family lineage, and kind of the international infrastructure that has come of that, the Christian roots behind that, the ways that organizations now have sprung up and like make their money from that act of like child trafficking throughout the world, and know that when people say it's humanitarian, even if they're not acting from a place of believing that themselves it's humanitarian, that it perpetuates that idea within intra-country adoption, that in order to save children, in order to like better society, we have to remove them from the global south and bring them to the global north. And all of the things related to race and class and ethnicity and nationality that, and religion especially, that like brings along with it.
That was great, Joy. If I may, I'll amplify a little bit. So I was in the first wave. I'm like a billion years older than everyone else. I think I'm older than the combination of their ages. But anyway, so I was in the first wave. I was born in 1960 and adopted a few months later. I was adopted with my twin brother. Actually, we were so ill in the orphanage, we couldn't fly over until we were 8 months old. Because in those days, to get to the Midwest of the U.S., you had to get on 4 flights, 4 completely separate plane flights. From Seoul to Tokyo, Tokyo to Anchorage, Anchorage to Seattle, Seattle to Midway, because all Harry was but the thing that Joy said is exactly right. So Harry and Bertha Holt were missionaries, and they were in Korea at the end of the war. Now, this one fact really speaks to how international adoption may have gone forward. Most of the children who were adopted out of Korea were not true orphans, meaning they had lost both parents. They had no actual parents. Most of the children were very poor. And one of the weird facts that I learned as an adult was that you could park your children in an orphanage because the country was so poor at the time. You could put your child in an orphanage, and it was weirdly like a pawn shop thing, because you were very poor, you didn't have money to feed your child. You took your child to the orphanage, they fed your child, and then you could come back and get your child. But in the meantime, if someone expressed interest and the wheels started rolling, then your child was adopted out to another country. So that was a weird facet, but kind of speaks to what the situation was. There were hundreds of thousands of children in rags, trying to get food out of garbage cans in the streets. And so in my case, I'm certain my parents were very young and very poor. So, but Harry Holt had many friends who were Protestant ministers, especially in the upper Midwest. So one of the things that happened was, like Minnesota became ground zero for Korean adoption. There are thousands and thousands of Korean adoptees in Minnesota. And no, they don't all know each other. But anyway, then another thing happened, which was the Vietnam War and the Operation Baby Lift. So already the laws had been modified so that children could be adopted out of South Korea. And then in Vietnam, of course, there was the crisis when the South Vietnamese government fell, and we all know about that. So then they were trying to rush these children out of Vietnam. And in Vietnam, much more than Korea, you had biracial children who were children, offspring of GIs and Vietnamese women. So there was this huge Operation Baby Lift, and thousands and thousands of kids came out of that. And the laws were modified again. So that was kind of how international adoption came about as a world phenomenon, a global phenomenon. Most of the children adopted out of Korea and Vietnam either went to the United States or Canada or Western Europe, and a few went to Australia. Over time, it just became an industry and became less and less questioned. And then there's one other element that we have to mention, and that is, yes, Roe v. Wade, because once abortion became more accessible to more women in the United States, anyway, in this country, people were not so much pressured to carry a pregnancy to term. And so there were fewer babies available, and the crisis of infertility met the adoption industry, and so it became this huge thing. So South Korea still has the largest number of internationally adopted children adopted out of the country. There are probably about 200,000 of us around the world, which is really wild, right? And I have Korean adoptee friends specifically. I have many, many transracial and international adoptee friends, but Korean adoptee friends in every country in Western Europe, in Australia, so we're all over the place and we have every kind of name. So back to the basic question about humanitarianism. One of the things that happened was humanitarianism, and I know we're going to talk about saviorism in a moment, but humanitarianism and saviorism got baked into our discourse around international adoption. And when you add in the transracial aspect, and yes, as Joy mentioned, the religious aspect, they become very powerful. There was this huge group of children adopted from countries in Central Africa before most of those countries had to shut down because of the corruption, but they were adopting thousands and thousands of children from Uganda and Congo, and then the practices were so corrupt that those countries were basically compelled to stop. And most of those children, this was around the year 1998 through about 2005, were adopted by right-wing evangelical white parents in the United States. And the discourse around that set of adoptions was intensely infused with humanitarian and saviorist construct. So anyway, I hope that was helpful.
Honestly, I appreciate all your answers, and I totally agree. Adoption has such a deep history with humanitarianism, and one thing within the adoption institution, it does tend to be cheaper and faster to adopt children of color than their white counterparts. And there is such a history of religion in that propaganda, such a history of war orphans, and really describing it in a first world and third world theory. And with that, I would like to ask you all, is a humanitarian a colonizer?
I'll just say, I know Joy probably could go on for hours about this, right? I'll just
What gave you that impression?
I'll just say one thing, which is it's a really fascinating dialogue to have, because colonialism is a subject that has 1,000 layers to it, right? I think that there is a very strong colonialist construct. At the same time, there are nuances, and the one thing I'll say is we have to also respect that there are nuances, and that we can, like, for example, I do believe that the way in which the first set of international adoptions from South Korea took place had a neo-colonial aspect to it. It absolutely did. Does that mean that everyone involved has a colonialist attitude? No, not necessarily. But phenomena can support colonialism and neo-colonialism even when significant percentages of the individuals and organizations involved do not have that construct in their minds, if that makes sense. Joy?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that segue and that nuance, because I do think that, right, like you're mentioning the intent of people, that like they may not be thinking about it as a colonial act, right? And it's still perpetuating colonialism.
Yeah.
Right? So it's still perpetuating like that idea that it's okay to like extract resources from another place for our benefit, right? And in this case, it was the extraction of children and the extraction of other people's reproductive labor. And so in the U.S., there in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, there was a really big push to have children, right? Like that's why it's called the baby boom era. And so in order to, and this is not like my original idea, this comes from a researcher and writer named Elena Kim, who does a lot of research and writing on transnational adoption and its relationship with globalism and imperialism, but she writes about how the pressure to have children, the pressure to create family, starting from the 50s, going into the 60s, and even through today, really like infused what became of transnational adoption with that colonial viewpoint, right? That idea that like, okay, like in order to complete your family, like your family is a set. And so like if you can't, it's right, like if you can't have your own, like other country bought is totally fine. That like if you cannot have your own children, then like there are other children available for you for just a little bit more money. Completely ignoring like the reproductive labor of the cisgender women like in those other countries, completely ignoring the idea of like family ties, cultural ties, all those pieces. And so I think in that way, like humanitarian here is standing in for like adoptive parent or adopter in many ways and goes beyond that, right? So I would say another way that the humanitarian is also a colonizer is by like going in humanitarian work, like going into a country to like help fix something or help save something without being interested in transforming the root causes of why that thing is happening in order to reap reward for yourself, whether you believe that it is going to be like eternal salvation, for instance, like in the idea of evangelical Christianity. I would say like in that sense, the humanitarian, whether that person is, like going to proselytize Christianity or going to adopt a child or going to like build some houses or like give out some Tom's shoes to like all the people who say they're going to convert to Christianity. Like that's really colonial behavior because Christianity and Western thinking are like they're colonial things, right?
Yeah.
Like they're colonial constructs.
Can I add to support that?
Sure.
I completely agree with everything you said, Joy. I'll add another layer to that. One of the people I know is an author named Jane Jong Trenko, who lives in Korea. She's a Korean adoptee. She was raised in Minnesota by her white adopted parents. Her parents were told, their Lutheran pastor in the small town in Minnesota said, you'd better get kids. Because at that time, and she's about 10 years younger than I am, but there was still this notion that you had to, if you were heterosexually married, you had to have children. Like there was something wrong with you if you didn't. And I'm old enough to remember how people who were childless were pitied openly. Oh, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, how terrible. They are childless, as opposed to now in 2023, it's totally different. But the colonialism and the Christianity combined there, right? Because the Trenkas, well, actually, that was not her original name, but anyway, her adopted parents were told by their pastor, you're good Christians, right? You better have kids. And they were infertile, so they adopted Jane and her sister. So there was always a strong religious component to adoption. And one of the things, I'll just say as a personal, one of the things I give my parents credit for, they were very pious Christians, but they and they were constantly offered the opportunity to bathe in savioristic praise. People were constantly saying, oh, you were so good. You adopted those 2 little twin boys, and oh, you're wonderful people. My mother always rejected it, which I give her great credit for, because she said, no, we weren't able to have children. We adopted children. We're the lucky ones. We're not saviors. We're not. But that construct was always there, and it was almost always religious as well as colonialist.
I mean, Sarah, this was your question. I'm curious to know what you think.
I think I agree with you. It's so nuanced and so complicated because the system is deeply colonial. I also agree with the fact that with my adopting parents, I don't think they adopted me with the mindset of, oh, I'm a colonizer, anything like that. You know, my parents were older, my mother had diabetes, and so they decided to adopt my sister and myself. And at the same time, you know, with the act of humanitarianism, there is oftentimes a lot of pushing of one's ideology, of one's religion. And so, is a humanitarian a colonizer? I want to say yes, but I also think not all humanitarians are necessarily colonizers, but the institution of it definitely tends to perpetuate that ideology. And I think a lot of that can be seen in social interactions through like microaggressions and full-on aggressions of those ideologies of like, again, as you were mentioning, oh, it's so great that you adopted these poor children. I remember when I was around 5 years old, my adopted mother told my sister and I to pick out a toy and, you know, she'll buy it for us. And so we're in the store and we pick out a toy, but we don't know if that's the toy we really want. So we hold on to it as we continue to look. And my mom's like doing her own shopping, doing her own thing as we're like in the toy section. And this older white woman stopped us and told us to put the toy back and how we didn't deserve it because our adopted parents already spent enough money adopting us. And I think that was very messed up, but like also it's very telling of a lot of subconscious thoughts and relationships of humanitarianism in this system, and at least in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's reinforced by society. Even now, people tell me, oh, you were so lucky to be adopted, which is a little bit astonishing to hear in your 60s. You know, like, it's a little, and that goes, the other flip side, or the other element of that is, and I'd love to hear everyone on the panel opine about this, but we adoptees, especially transracial and international adoptees, are infantilized, and we're seen as perpetual children. And when we get into discussions, especially with adoptive parents, on adoption-related issues, we're seen as children. We're seen as maybe grown-up children, big children, you know. But it's as though we're also stripped of our intellectual agency in a way, right? Like it's the flip side of we have to be grateful because we're saved, and at the same time, we can never really be truly objective because we were the saved children, right? So the parents can be, I mean, no one ever says this directly. No one says, you know, you are infants forever, but there's subconscious thought, and a lot of that has to do, so it's colonialism, saviorism, and paternalism, and then religiosity. All packed into one sandwich, basically.
I totally agree. Honestly, I would love to hear your thoughts, Maddie.
Sure. All right. So I think I have more of a similar experience with Sarah. So we were adopted on the more recent side of the scale, so probably not dealing with a lot of the issues with Korean adoption specifically that were happening like 50, 60 years ago. But I can speak on my parents. I've asked them about these questions because obviously I want to know their answer, and it's not a lot of things that we've discussed before. And they tell me my dad is a white dude, and my mom is a Chinese woman. So I always get those weird stares when I'm with my dad, and then it's totally fine if I'm with my mom. But many times they've said, people walk up to us and are like, "You're so good. You saved 2 kids." And my mom gets extremely actively upset about that because, it's the assumption that they bought us so that they could get praise, and it's the assumption that we were a commodity to be bought. And she really wasn't looking at it like that. Neither of them were. So I think, is the humanitarian a colonizer? It really depends because some parents don't go into it thinking like that, and especially because my parents didn't raise me with any religious motive, like where you're talking about evangelicalism or anything like that. I grew up Jewish, but nothing about that is because they wanted to be a good saint or anything like that. So in my opinion, my parents weren't looking at it with that humanitarian aspect as much, so I wouldn't call them colonizers. But definitely the bringing of Western individuals, adopting the kids from third world-ish countries, I think it can definitely lend itself to that that understanding by outside lookers. So yeah.
If I may, I'd like to add a note of irony. So here's the funny thing that happened. Those of us in the early waves of international adoption experienced all of this stuff, and our parents got all the savioristic comments and thank God I was never with my parents when they were asked how much they paid for us, but many people had that experience. But the irony is, even though I was raised in a very conservative social environment, I ended up being ultra progressive, right? So part of the irony for many of us transracial adoptees is that all of this stuff that happened actually pushed us towards being more progressive in our thought, partly because we found ourselves compelled to examine the attitudes around us, right? I grew up in near total whiteness. I wanted to be a person of color. I wanted to find my identity, and I could only find it once I was in a very large city, once I was in Chicago, a large diverse city. So everything that happened, in some ways to me is a little bit ironic, right? Virtually all the Korean adoptees I know were really raised in religious homes, at least the early wave Korean adoptees. Only a small number of us remain religious. It's like it flipped in a certain way, partly because of the intensity of our experiences. Does that resonate a little with you, Joy?
Well, I was just going to comment on what you said about Korean adoptees being raised in religious homes because, that part to me is unsurprising because it was part of the criteria. It was a requirement that you had to be heterosexual, that you had to be religious. For a long time, your BMI had to be under a certain number in order to adopt. And so, these are, I know, right? That's super fucked up. So, these
well,
are...
that came about kind of in the 70s. So
these are different ways in which, in which the requirements of, what is needed in order to adopt, perpetuate that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, go ahead.
I just have a question for Sarah. I think Chinese adoption is pretty different than Korean adoption, just as far as we had the one-child policy.
Right.
So I think that motivation for why parents were adopting from China maybe have been a different experience than Korea specifically, because you're talking a lot about religious aspects. And I was just wondering, in your research, Sarah, if you could compare those two, because a lot of the Chinese adopted individuals from China that I've spoken to, they're not in religious homes. So I think that's interesting, and I'm wondering if you've had any research into that.
So I definitely think there's a lot of variation. I'm not gonna lie, I was in a religious home. And so, with the one-child policy, there's definitely a lot of propaganda and promotion in relation to like genocide. Have you ever seen the documentary The Dying Rooms? It's a pretty gruesome documentary, and it talks about like the orphanages in China and specifically focuses on this area called the Dying Rooms. And it's definitely it's a very difficult video to watch, but I definitely feel like it's a video that prompted a lot of people to feel the need to take action of needing to save these girls. And it is complicated in the fact that for a long time, there was a disproportionately large amount of like girls in Chinese orphanages and disabled children in Chinese orphanages. And so I think in some aspects, religion does interact with it, but it's not maybe as big of a pillar of the promotional drive of it.
Well, and society had changed too. You know, I know a number of gay couples who adopted from China after the year 2000, right? So it was a very different dynamic. And the frame around it was different too, which is instead of just poverty, like in South Korea and then later, you know, Guatemala and Ethiopia, you actually had a government policy that led to the deaths of huge numbers of baby girls, and then the desperation because you were only allowed one child, and the law in China is still that you cannot relinquish a child legally. So what happened was people like the uncle or grandfather or grandmother or something would take the child and the baby in a basket and put it in front of the police station or city hall, or would take the child to get on the bus and take the child to a far city and put the child somewhere where they knew they would immediately be discovered, right? Like they wouldn't be starving to death or something, but they would run away and get on another bus or something. So the difference there that was interesting is China was not, it was not just poverty, right? And so the dynamic had kind of shifted. And while there were many religious families adopting from China, there were many very secular families too. So it had kind of changed a little bit. And the way the discourse around it is different because it's a different circumstance. It was a non-Western country, but where they had imposed a policy that had created this effect of suffering of many people. And then you had the thousands and thousands and thousands of infant girls and very young female children in orphanages. So I think that changed some things, you know. There was still a humanitarian frame for many people. It was a different kind of humanitarianism.
I completely agree with that because, you know, with there still being that humanitarian frame, but with that, I actually would like to ask you all another question is, do you think the act and idea of humanitarianism helps adoptees or hurts adoptees more? I know.
Both?
Yeah,
No, go ahead.
Go ahead. I just said both, but go ahead.
I wasn't sure if you wanted to go first.
Oh, no, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so humanitarianism in this context, when I think about it, is like always going to be framed as a movement of rescue, like from the global north to the global south, right? And so in that sense, humanitarianism looks pretty much like one way, right? It looks like some sort of act of like saving or rescue or extraction. And I think that not only hurts adoptees, both domestically and also internationally, right? That idea that like we need to rescue children, which of course it's like that idea, it's so ingrained in like the minds of right-wing adults across many issues, right? That we always just have to save children. But that humanitarianism kind of always refuses to like actually do the thing that will support children, like, and move beyond just the rhetoric of saving them. And so, yeah, when I think like, I'm looking at the question again, do I think the act and idea of humanitarianism helps adoptees or hurts adoptees? Well, so in this context, like the idea of humanitarianism, and especially if we're thinking about transracial adoptees as well as transnational transracial adoptees, that humanitarianism is always going to leave a gap between like what people think is needed and what is actually needed to support children and women and families in whatever country, right? So humanitarianism is like never actually going to like be good foreign policy. Like humanitarianism is not going to like tell us that we should be like ending war. Humanitarianism is never going to say that like we should support like denuclearization, like having fewer nuclear weapons around the world. And like in this country, like humanitarianism is never going to say like, let's just give cash payments to poor parents instead of removing their children from them and then giving stipends to foster parents to raise those children, right? So like humanitarianism is always going to say like, let's pay foster parents to raise these children that we've removed, mostly from Black women, right? So that they can be re-raised and remade in the image of whiteness, and let's like financially support that instead. And like that's never gonna help adoptees. That like whether that is happening or whether like people are thinking in that frame, it's never ever gonna help adoptees. What will actually help adoptees is having housing, having health care, like having cultural and linguistic connections, like being able to be tied to their families and their both nuclear families and extended families, being able to live in a planet that's like not actively being overtaken by climate chaos and global warming. And so, yeah, I mean, humanitarian does a lot of things, right? Like it builds a lot of houses. I went to Haiti after the earthquake. It provided a lot of blue tents, and it also called for like the removal of Haitian children from Port-au-Prince in ways that were like really ethically gray and like not wholly legal. And like that doesn't help those children either. It just says and tells them from a young age that like where you were was like we never thought it was gonna be good enough for you, like unless you are allow yourself to like be remade in the image of the white Christian heterosexual middle class global north.
Yeah, and it's individually focused. Humanitarianism is we'll save this child. I completely agree with what you said. The complexity, here's the funny complexity. I know a number of Haitian adoptees. So they have great complexity about Haiti because Haiti really is a disaster. It's just terrible to live there now. And that's not a critique of their culture. It's just the society has kind of fallen apart in a certain way. Certainly the civil society, and there's no order. It's disorder. So Haitian adoptees feel weird because they were kind of rescued, right? But how can they relate to their birth culture in ways that aren't shaming to the culture, right? Mm-hmm. So it's very, very complex. I also know Guatemalan adoptees, and some Latin American adoptees have the situation because their countries remain poor. For us, it's very weird. For me, anyway, I'll just speak for myself. For me, it's very weird to be a Korean adoptee because Korea now is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So I go to Korea and it's like New York with all yellow faces, right? And so it's weird because when I was born, it was a complete disaster. And you can Google photos of what it was like in 1960, and it was terrible. It was still, but now it's super wealthy. And like you go to Seoul and you go to the Gangnam area, and it's like the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And you're like, this is so weird. I was adopted out of this very poor country, and now this country is one of like the 11 wealthiest countries in the world. But for those who are adopted out of countries that are still very impoverished, there's that weird, like, how do you frame what happened to you, right? Like, how do you, because you were, if we don't want to say rescued, we could say extracted. You were extracted out of a country in poverty, and you were brought into middle-class comfort in the United States or Europe. And so what do you do with that, right? It's hard, I think, for adoptees. And I know, as I say, Haitian, Guatemalan adoptees, they're like, I don't even know how to think about this anymore, right? Like, I have a big flag of Haiti on, pinned to my wall in my bedroom, but I know that people are suffering. Yeah.
I mean, I think that brings up a good point, and I also, I think it invites bigger questions about poverty,
Yeah.
right? Like poverty, like inflation, right? Like it's not a passive action. It's not something that just happens. It's something that like people cause to happen, and
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
like I think about the budget of Whole International, and I think about all the donations, like individual donations and church donations and donations that are made to an organization like that, or to like World Vision, right? Like I wrote a poem, and the epigraph I put before the poem was from an ad that World Vision had placed in the LA Times, and the ad said, "A Korean orphan for you, yours for the asking."
Oh, God.
And so I think about World Vision, right? Like if all the money that went to World Vision,
Yeah.
like actually went in some sort of like foreign aid to like restabilize a country, or like if the U.S. had not like meddled in the affairs of so many of these countries through either like the agencies that we know about, the ones that like have to report back to Congress, right? Or like even more terrifyingly, like the agencies that we don't know about, the agencies that like are off the books, right? The things that are like too dangerous for the FBI and the CIA that like we don't know about. And I think about like, what if that had never happened?
Yeah.
Right? And so like those countries like wouldn't be in political instability, which wouldn't lead to poverty, which wouldn't lead to this idea that like then children are going to be better off somewhere else. That like if we go back and getting very animated, my mic. If we go back in time and think about like those original humanitarian roots and then go back and redo them, the idea that like, yeah, redo that entire view of humanitarianism like as like U.S. foreign policy, and instead do something that's like completely different, then like we wouldn't even be raising a question of like, is someone who was born in Haiti better off maybe like in Miami because like there's no political infrastructure in Haiti, and also like in many ways just no like logistical like built
Right.
environment infrastructure. Like is that the question we should be asking, or is the question we should be asking like, well, let's look at Haiti's history and like try to undo all of that?
Like
Yeah.
a perfect example of what you're saying is Guatemala. So the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, the United States overthrew a whole bunch of governments and supported ultra right-wing dictatorships for decades. And then we allowed, because of Americans' desire for drugs, drug gangs emerged in those three countries. And now those three countries are they really are disasters. And that's not a judgment. It's just really, that's why we have so many people fleeing up to our borders. So here you had a situation in the 1990s and early 2000s, before Guatemala was closed to outbound international adoption, where people were coming up to poor young women, like in the marketplace. You're this 24-year-old woman, you already got 5 kids, and you're walking through the marketplace with a baby slung over you, and some strange person comes up to you and says, "Hey, I'll give you $5,000 for that baby." And you are very impoverished, and $5,000 is like $1 million, And so Guatemala had to shut down because of these corrupt practices. But if the United States government hadn't supported repressive dictatorships for decades and decades, they wouldn't have been in such poverty. So that's to support what you just said, Joy. That's how we ended up in that situation. So in most cases, in very few cases, were the children adopted from Guatemala before it shut down true orphans. Very, very few cases. It was mostly that they had very poor families who couldn't support them, and they were basically sold or given away. And that came out of the fact that these countries in Central America were impoverished over decades. And our country bore some responsibility for that. So it's very strange for a Guatemalan adoptee in the United States if they were adopted by a very well-off upper middle class family in this country, because they then the mirror and they look back at the country they came from, and they visit it, and it's still deeply impoverished, but their own adoptive country had something to do with the impoverishment of their birth country over decades. So it's all connected, right?
I totally agree. I think that's one of the very difficult things with humanitarianism is it's so deeply interconnected to capitalism.
Yeah.
It's so interconnected to reproductive rights. It's so interconnected to politics. And it's something that can't be separated. And in that way, it does, I think, often do harm because of how it's interconnected to these things. And I think you guys brought up some really great questions. Although I would actually like to ask Maddie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting to hear all the knowledge that you guys have researched about all of this. And, I think when we put it in perspective of how much money the United States actually spends on adoption, I don't know if you guys are aware, but it's like $14 to $24 billion, anywhere in that, according to a couple of papers. What you were talking about, what that money could do instead of, stealing these children from these places. I think it's really, really crucial to put that into perspective. So,
yeah. And by the way, per what you just said, Sarah, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have an absolute ban on abortion, and they also make it impossible for anyone but an upper middle class woman to access birth control. So the women in those countries are in this terrible situation, and birth control is technically legal, but unless you're fairly affluent, you can't access it. So they're stuck, right? And so it's all connected.
Mm-hmm. I do want to be respectful of everyone's time, and we're all getting close. So I would like to ask you all one last question, and then we'll jump into the Q&A.
Yeah.
So what do you wish people knew about adoption? I think that's a nice way to close us off. And then Q&A.
all right, I can start. I think Mark mentioned in the beginning that it's interesting, it's ironic how, we come into these families and then we become progressive. And it's not like I didn't start progressive, but I'm definitely progressive. I come from a diversity from a multitude of levels, racially, religiously. It's just interesting for me. I was placed into a white suburbia. So it was very interesting, but it really made me stronger. And, it helps me give me that perspective. And a lot of my future goals, involve supporting like minority groups and just trying to make sure that it doesn't stay like how I grew up in. So I think it does definitely give you that aspect of, we were an outsider, or at least I felt like it, but then you really start to grow and see how you can make an impact. So I think it's a really important but lifelong, journey for adoption, and it's not cheap for the adoptive parents, and my parents really love me and I'm really appreciative of them. So I think that's what I have to say about it.
Well, I would just say, if you're interested, delve into the literature of transracial adoption created by transracial adoptees. And the great thing, so my parents adopted me and my twin brother in 1960, 61. There were zero resources. And when I say zero, I mean zero. There was nothing. There were no books. Now we've got books, documentaries, blogs, interviews, articles. There's even music, poetry, art, all created by us transracial adoptees. So if you really want to get a sense of what, and that was certainly a surprise for all the people in the adoption agencies, right? That we grow up and we write all these things and do all these things. But if you really want to learn about the complexity of transracial adoption and international adoption, delve into our literature. I mean, that's what I wrote a book 2 years ago, and I've contributed chapters to books just to help people understand all this. So I think that's my recommendation. Joy?
Yeah, thank you for that. We all grew up. We got really creative. They underestimated us.
Yes.
One thing I wanted to say is that this is a panel of transnational, transracial adoptees, and like all of our perspectives are really different, and also like our perspectives are super different than folks who are adopted within the US and are also not East Asian. So every adoptee has their own experience. We have our own stories, and I think it's important to look at adoption as an industry and is like a cultural phenomenon apart from individual adoptees' feelings about our adoptions. That's going back to your question about colonization and colonialism. Like that's one thing that colonialism does to us, right? Like it removes individual blame by like letting that goodness shine through, right? Another thing I wanted to share. And I'm going to read this from the introduction of my chapbook, a chapbook of poetry that I wrote about adoption. And I'm going to read this because I feel like I wrote it well, and if I were to just try and think of it from my memory, I would not. I would not say it as well as I wrote it. So in the US, this transnational, wait, I didn't want to start there. So I'm one of more than 200,000 children, now adults, adopted from the south of Korea since the early 50s. What began as a partnership of convenience between a Korean president eager to rid his country of mixed-race children born to unmarried women, a US government desperate to prove its inclusivity to the world against domestic racial violence and global anti-communist ambitions, and an evangelical Christian American family with a personal mission to relocate babies they deemed unfortunate and in need of saving, has grown into $1 billion global network for removing children from Asia and Africa, Central and South America, and the former Soviet Union, and placing them in families primarily in the US, Australia, and Northern and Western Europe. In the US, this transnational adoption infrastructure built and continues to build on the existing legacies of ancestral interruption and cultural genocide that have disproportionately impacted Black, Indigenous, Latine, poor and working class, disabled, teenage and youth, migrant and refugee, and transgender and queer parents and families for generations. Since the initial contact of settler colonizers and chattel slavery, there have been violent power dynamics imposed surrounding who gets and or has to birth, who gets to keep the children they birth, and who gets and or has to raise the children they did not birth, and who gets to make decisions about all of the above. So I want to make sure that that legacy of colonization, settler colonialism, especially in the US, doesn't get lost in our conversation from an East Asian perspective, because really it did build and continues to build on the cultural genocide that has impacted enslaved Black families and murdered Indigenous families a lot longer than it's impacted any of our ancestors.
I totally agree with and appreciate all of y'all's answers. And before I say anything, I just want to thank all of our beautiful, amazing, wonderful panelists for joining us today and really just sharing their time. I know that it's been somewhat said, but I want to say listen to adoptee voices, and I want to say, adoption is not without its history, and it's a very important history to talk about and be aware of. And honestly, I just feel so blessed to be here at this panel with such amazing people. And with that, let's get into our Q&A if anyone has questions. Yes.
Also, thank you, Sarah, for bringing us together. And thank you for the art that you make. It's really powerful. It's really beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you.
So this kind of segues actually kind of to what you were talking about, Joy. First of all, are you all up to date with what's happened with the ICWA in India's
Indian Child Welfare Act.
Yes.
Yeah, ICWA, yeah.
And are you?
Somewhat, but
Okay. Well, for those of you that aren't on the panel, just really quickly, there are a bunch of white families that sued, basically contested the act because they said they were being discriminated against. Because the act itself allows for the tribes to have first say what happens to Indigenous children. And I think the last thing I know is it being brought to the Supreme Court in fall 2022. So that's fun to watch. But what I want to ask more about specifically is, because we're talking about the colonialist aspect and also kind of how adoption has kind of changed in the minds. One of the things that struck me was how these parents were insistent, well, prospective parents were insistent how, the way that they spoke about it was as if they had a right to have a child, which I personally disagree with. I think it's privilege but not a right to have a child, but how, because there's that change away from not just humanitarianism, but this right to have a child, how those, if and how they conflate with the previous humanitarianism and colonialism, and I guess what we could do to combat that, because they both seem to, instead of counteracting each other, they seem to make it worse. Sorry, this is very
No, that's a great question. I'm like trying to fill my thoughts together. Did you have a answer?
I'm still putting my thoughts together too.
Well, I can share thoughts, because I've had this. So in terms of the, like, my belief in reproductive justice, that like everybody should be able to create the family that they want to create, and like that being in conflict of like, that doesn't necessarily mean you're entitled to like own someone else's child. Like, those two things being in conflict has gotten me into a lot of trouble in reproductive justice community. And in reproductive justice community that doesn't have a strong like adoptee lens in it, that where the perspective of adoptive parents is being privileged over adoptees. And so, yeah, when you were asking that question, that is one of the first things it makes me think of, is that like just because you can believe that like everybody can create the family that they want, it doesn't mean that they're entitled to someone else's child, and that there are political ramifications for that. Like, English is my first language, actually, because that's what colonization did. But one of the things I think about too, and like, I think that like that colonial aspect, right? That like white people should be able to have have dibs on like indigenous people's children is just like really, really gross, right? That like of
They're arguing that indigenous people shouldn't have dibs on their own.
right. That's yeah. So like but they want to get rid of the Indian Child Welfare Act so that they would be able to like get rid of that indigenous sovereignty, which I think just also in that case like has led to like that raises bigger questions about indigenous sovereignty overall, which I think is really important. Like democracy now, which, for better or for worse, Amy Goodman, I've stuck with you for like 20 or something years, even though democracy now has lots of issues. But I would encourage everybody to look at the coverage that they did of when this case was heard at the Supreme Court back in the fall, because like almost no other media outlet covered it and covered it in any depth. But I also, another thing I think about is, like children in the U.S. who have been removed from their parents and are in the juvenile child welfare system, and so are seen as like, well, we just have too many children in foster care, and so like that is why everybody should be able to like have foster children. And like I deeply believe that like queer parents, like I'm a queer person, I deeply believe that queer parents should not be discriminated against when it comes to adoption. And it makes me feel real ick about the fact that like when we talk about National Adoption Month, that like the first thing that comes up from like LGBTQ organizations is always like, here's this couple trying to like adopt this child that got taken away from a Black mother, and like that's the reason why this needs to exist, instead of like, let's maybe make the child removal system a lot less racist. And then maybe like there wouldn't be such a need for people to be like adopting from the child welfare system in general, right? So thank you for your question. It raised a lot of things for me. Yeah.
I agree with Joy, and thank you so much for your question, because it's because I feel a lot of icks with that too, yeah. Where I'm like, and just, I'm still working on formulating it, but.
It's scary because when I was reading about it, and obviously I'm a Nazi too, so I'm aware of humanitarianism, and I was adopted a bit earlier than you guys, like a year before you. But there's still that humanitarianism that comes from that, partially because when China was doing its twin policy, it wasn't particularly wealthy either, and the stuff that was happening in the 50s and 60s with Hong Kong. So it's like it's still attached to us, and so what scared me was reading the stuff that they made, the ICW is that it's instead of counteracting and making people aware of the humanitarianism, it seems to make it more of a monster. That they set off each other. And that scared me more because it like empowers those people to think that they're even better now.
Yeah. Other questions?
So this question kind of relates to colonialism aspect. So very often there's like a conflict of cultures necessarily, not necessarily, but often in like the adoptive family and the child. But maybe in modern trend, it seems like white families want to like represent this culture through their kids, or from Korea or something. Do you think that's enough? If, they are a white family, but they're like trying to like bring this home culture to this child, or is it just like half-assed and it's not really?
So it's incredibly complex with layers. One of the things that I often talk about with adoptive parents is I came up with a term, postcard culture. So let me just context this. When I was a young child, birth cultures were trashed and birth parents were trashed. Oh, you came from this terrible, dirty, poor country. You were saved, blah, blah, blah. Then the pendulum kind of swung to the opposite direction, where you have internationally adoptive parents idealizing their child's birth culture. And that's not so great either, because what happens is, and they only know about the child's birth culture in the most superficial terms, like how you wrap a sari, that's Indian culture, how you wrap kimbap, that's Korean culture, how you drum, how you dance. And one of the things I try to explain to the parents is that you have to learn as much as you can about your child's birth culture so you can be prepared to help them begin to walk through it themselves. So, for example, female Indian adoptees from India, at some point they're going to find out about the almost surreal level of misogyny in Indian culture, right? That gang rape is still basically acceptable in Indian culture. So you can't, on the one hand, I definitely don't want anyone to trash original cultures. But these parents really need to learn first of all, they just have to learn. They have to learn everything they can about their child's culture in context, and hopefully learn some language if that's apropos also, so that they can help their child, because their child is going to have a complex relation to their culture. So I have a very complex relationship with Korean culture because it's very racist and homophobic and misogynist and clannish and narrow. And so my interaction with Korean culture has been very fraught. I go back to Korea. I'm a gay man. I also have a child, biologic to me. My daughter's a young adult now. And the first thing you get asked in Korea, well, the very first thing you actually get asked is how much you weigh. And then you get asked how much money you make. And then after that, are you married? And if not, why not? And do you have children? And if not, why not? It's like this village culture, right? So my interactions are always going to be fraught with Korean culture because I don't fit. So I would urge adoptive parents to be in a position so that when their child is 10 years old and they were born in India and they find out that gang rape is still basically societally acceptable in India, you have to be in a position to explain it to some level of nuance. That is how I feel about that. And a lot of adoptive parents, either they fall on either side. Either they're just going to trash the culture. Oh, you came from this horrible culture. Or in more recent years, everything is wonderful, and we eat Indian food, and and neither works. Does that answer your question at all? Yeah, it's. I don't know any international adoptees who don't have some level of complexity in their relationship with their birth culture.
I can attest to that. Having recently grown up through trying to navigate all of that, and with my mom being Chinese, she's a first generation Chinese individual. It's really imperative for me. I went to Chinese school. I've been back to China. So I think it's really, if I hadn't had those experiences and been able to become more aware and ask those questions, and if they weren't prepared to talk to me about it, it would have been even more isolating. But I think my parents specifically were very prepared to talk about sorts of issues like that. But yeah, I think it's definitely important to make sure that they still have an understanding of where they came from and are allowed to explore all of that, because if you're just shut in and expected to, not explore who you were going to be type thing, it can be really isolating. So
I agree, and I would say I think parents should really listen to their children and also allow them to be okay with not exploring it if they don't want to, be okay to explore later if they want to, because we all have different feelings about our birth country and our birth culture. I think it's really important for the parents to be open to what the adoptee wants.
I agree with most of what everyone has said. The last thing that I'll add is that I think there are, like now, as transracial, especially transnational adoption has shifted from something that's like been primarily done by evangelical and like mainline Protestant folks, and now is like there's a lot more like liberal and progressive white folks who are adopting. Like there is this idea that like instead of like no exposure to culture, like liberal white parents will see themselves as like being able to connect to whatever culture they want to, like through their adoptive children, and like that's also bad, right? So like there are a lot of families now who want to like build a like rainbow family, or who like want to be able to like, and this is also colonialism, right? Like whether you're liberal or whether you're right wing, like thinking that like you can adopt somebody else's culture by like experiencing it through your child. And so like that's also really fraught and like goes too much the other way. So I would say that, yeah, there are ways that children can have exposure to culture and like be allowed to explore that on their own, like without their parents. Because I also have seen parents that are like, oh, like we get to be Korean now, or like we get to be Indian now, or like we get to be XYZ culture now because like their kid is, and like that's why they adopted their child like from another country. Yeah.
And the most cringeful thing is to see white parents wearing Korean hanbok, traditional clothing, or what, you know, whatever the original country is. It's like some white parents have heard, so that they've gotten the memo, so they're like, yeah, we're not supposed to wear hanbok. But the ones who are just like, oh, our whole family is going to dress in hanbok, you know, and you have one Korean child and everyone else is white. It gets really fraught, as Joy said.
Any other questions?
Oh, yeah, yes, hi.
Yes.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Who wants to go first?
All the questions, so many questions.
Oh,
I have a question. So the U.S. is expanding its military presence in the Philippines, which is my country, and they're expecting Aboriginal births to like quadruple in the next couple of years. Just like it's a compounding crisis, and I'm just wondering, like as visionaries, what are some potential like solutions or ways of
birth
seeing
control?
outcomes for this?
Yeah, I mean, like one of the things that comes to mind the most is, thank you for raising this question. This is a really excellent question. The thing that comes to mind first for me is, as like call to action of like things that people can do, is to connect to like groups in the US that have that like transnational feminist perspective, like Anak Bayan or similar groups, in order to like stop and stand in the way of US militarization in the Philippines. Like these sorts of groups have been doing that for a really long time. I think like gathering resources to support women who like do become pregnant, whether consensually or non-consensually, and like being able to keep their children and raise their children, and like fighting for that as well. Those were the first things that came to mind. I'm gonna think on it a little bit more.
And I think it's hard because inevitably, you know, I know so many Korean adoptees who are half Korean, half American. Actually, I've met Black Korean adoptees. So they were the offspring of Black GIs and Korean women, and they experienced so much discrimination in Korea that they were all adopted in the United States by Black families. So, yeah, I think it's unfortunate. I don't know. I wish that, I mean, honestly, though, birth control, like, you know, part of, there's a colonialism there too, because here we're this military power, so we send people over there. there's never in history been a situation where soldiers didn't impregnate women, you know, in every culture and every situation in history. And so some of that's going to be inevitable, but I really feel sorry for the children who come out of those couplings because they will also experience discrimination over there too. So they're immediately then torn between different worlds, and that, you know, it's not a great thing. If you have an individual soldier who decides to stay in the Philippines for whatever reason, let's say they do fall in love with a person from that country, and they want to make a life there, and they want to raise their child biculturally, that's a different thing. But yeah, it's going to be hard, I think.
It might feel like language, but I would say that nothing about military violence is ever inevitable. That we have the ability to dream new and different worlds.
I just want to say thank you for that question.
And over here, we had a question here. So
I'm kind of a disembodied voice, so people can't see me.
yeah.
I was just wondering, the role that adoption agencies play, I mean, historically, but more specifically today, and I know it's a huge question because it's specific to the country of origin. So I wonder, what role are they playing? Are they being responsive to the criticism of how it could be making things worse? And also, the question of regulation when you describe somebody buying a baby of a Guatemalan woman, it's like that child is, that child is not just taken, it's just that there's no regulatory context for what's going to happen to that child and the responsibility of the parents.
Yeah.
The adoptive parents. So it's a very convoluted question, but it has to do with the gatekeeping role of the agencies.
Right.
Agencies. So it's very broad.
No, it's right. So international adoption is becoming reduced over time. Adoption agencies are adopting out of fewer countries and in smaller numbers. In South Korea, Korean adoptees from the United States and Europe who have been living there have pressured the South Korean government to agree to end outbound international adoption. So the numbers are very small now, like 60 or 100 children a year. The problem is that they still have orphanages there, and children are growing up in orphanages. So then you have that whole issue, that children are growing up in orphanages who could grow up in families. Because if you grow up in an orphanage in East Asia and you age out, you have nothing. Everything is based on connections in East Asia. So that's very hard. But what is happening, so for example, the government of the Netherlands announced about 2 months ago they would no longer allow inbound international adoption. So things are changing, and many agencies are just shutting down in a lot of countries now because of how complicated it's become.
Although first we had a question back there, and then Karen.
I'm also researching about the transmission of China. I was just thinking about relating to specifically the Asian American identity. Thinking about I guess what would it mean if or how thinking about how we become racialized in the United States versus if we had grown up in a different country, in our birth countries, but still been adopted by white parents or adopted by people of the same race, I guess. I guess I was just wondering what is, if y'all want to talk about it, because I have some very personal question. What is your connection to Asian American, or what is your connection to your racial identity in the U.S.?
I would say I'm definitely still learning. I saw you at my opening for what color am I? And, it's definitely a lifelong journey. I think for me, it's also, I'm at a complicated stage where like both of my parents are deceased and I'm only 26. And so I'm really starting to, I guess, I'm working on trying to become more part of the Asian American community, but I'm also still so new in my navigation where right now I identify as a transracial, transnational Chinese American woman adoptee. But I also understand that as I grow older, that may change. And I think it's a constant journey. I like to say, like, one day you find that end of the rainbow. I don't know. I don't know. I think it's a lifelong journey of maybe some moments you're more a part of that community, maybe other moments you're not. But, you know, I want you to know that I'm here for you. I don't know.
Yeah. I think it is a lifelong journey. Actually, that's a part of the title of my book, Extraordinary Journey, The Lifelong Path of the Transracial Adoptee. I really kind of gave up on Korean Americans specifically because interacting with first-generation Korean Americans was just too difficult. They don't get us. They want us to be just like them. They're very paternalistic. Like every complaint I could lodge, I would lodge. By the time you get to third generation, they're cool, but they're as detached from traditional Korean culture as we are. So it's problematic. You know, I wonder whether, and then like if you're a Chinese adoptee and you're trying to interact with Chinese Americans, if you're interacting with really recent immigrants, they're not going to get you either. So this is why many adoptees just hang out with other adoptees, right? They're like, okay, I want to hang out with people who look like me and who've had similar experiences, but culturally, it's just very hard. I have not had good experiences with first-generation Korean Americans, and I'm not saying that out of judgment. It's just my lived experience. They want us to be exactly like them, and they want us to have Korean mentalities, and we don't. So I've just kind of given up on that.
I would agree. It's very difficult to navigate. I think one of the, like I've tried to explore a lot of that. Like again, as I said, I went to Chinese school, and my mom's side of the family is all Chinese, so I get to connect with my heritage in that way. However, like when I go to Chinatown, for example, it's very wrought with like, just I would say like, it's not usually like Chinese people anymore, and I think that's really evolved since like when I was young, like it was all like Chinese people. I'd go around and I would feel like really at home, and now when I go, it's like all rich Caucasians buying boba, and I think like it's really it makes me kind of uncomfortable because I don't want to be like I'm like an outsider in that sense, because like I'm learning, so are these white people that are learning, but like I'm Chinese, but it puts me in a weird place. Like I don't want to be like doing Chinese culture because of the pop culture aspect that is so big now, but like I still obviously want to learn, so it's kind of difficult because you're still coming at it from an outsider perspective. But I just keep trying and seeing what else, like how else I can like learn, even though it may feel less or more authentic sometimes. I haven't given up yet, but we'll see. We'll see. Yeah, for sure.
I wanted to thank you for your questions. A really brave question, so I appreciate you asking. And I think it can be really challenging and very complicated and complex to like figure out where you fit, like as a Chinese person, or for me, like as a Korean person, like in the US. And if you are interested, someone named Sarah White, who you might have heard of, is hosting another panel about Asian American identity and adoption identity and how those things mix and don't later this month at the Chinese American Museum, where you can also see her art because it will still be there in its exhibition. But I wanted to share a little bit about my experience too. Thank you for sharing your experiences. I actually, so I'm like I'm gonna get like a little emotional because like, so I'm on the community advisory board for the Global Asian Studies program, and so there were like staff and faculty here who were part of that program, and some of them were like among the first people that I met when I moved to Chicago, which is one of the reasons I'm so in love with Chicago. Like as a city, it's the first place that I have met Asian people who are queer and politicized, who are accepting of adoptees within their community, and I feel like that has kept me alive, like in Chicago, right? Like that has just like spoken to my spirit in a way that like no other place that I lived before did. And so I went head first into Pan-Asian community and found it to be a really beautiful space where I could bring all of my politics, and I could bring my desire for activism, and I could bring my queer self, and I could bring my weird self, and I could bring my adoptee self. And so I've been really lucky to have that, like spaces like Invisible to Invincible, Eye to Eye, which is an LGBTQ Pan-Asian group, spaces like Asian Americans Advancing Justice, which is a Pan-Asian advocacy group. And so because of that, like it's helped me connect to just being Asian and like feeling better about being Asian. And in recent years, I have been really, really lucky to be able to connect with being Korean. And so I'm sorry that you've had such a hard experience with Korean and Korean American community, because I know like I feel just so fortunate that my experience has been a little bit different than that.
I'm glad you have had a
yeah, one of the spaces that I have like really found home and connection in is a place called Hana Center, which is in Albany Park. It's a Korean social service, but also just like community space, advocacy space. And they have a racial justice committee, which is made up of folks who are like first gen, who are adoptees, who are like 1.5 second, third gen. We get together and we do political education together, and it's a mostly like monolingual Korean space. I'm one of the few folks there that's monolingual English, but it's been really, really healing for me to be able to have racial justice conversations with Korean people who are like the same age or as old as my birth mother, like about their activism in Korea, because Korea is just a place where there's like so much political history, such a history of resistance that like flows through my blood, that like makes me like very energized, that like makes me remember like, okay, this is why I'm different than my adoptive parents, because like this is like resistance is my birthright because I'm Korean. But being able to talk to first gen Korean women about the ways that like they fought back against the government, about the ways that like sexism impacted them, about how they're raising their children, like I'm like almost gonna cry right now because it's so powerful, and just like everything that they say to me has to be translated, but like just hearing the Korean that they speak to me, even though I don't know what it is, when it comes out of their mouth, I have to like wait for someone to tell me what it means in English. It just like makes my heart feel at home. And so I hope that like as you're navigating your own journey, that like you get moments like that or similar in the ways that you want to. I know that like every ethnic space is different, and Hana Center is both Hana Center and then also Canwin, which is another Korean, like another organization that like comes out of like Korean community and Korean tradition, are like both very open and accepting of adoptees. And I don't know as much about like Chinese specific organizations and like how, if they might have that flexibility, but I really, from my experience and like how powerful it's been, I really hope that you get that too as you're searching for it.
Okay,
Like, I don't think of Asian American community as like an ethnic identity.
Right.
Or cultural identity so much as the political community and the political identity that I can claim.
Yeah.
So for me, that's really important, and I guess I wanted to highlight that within Asian American studies, it would be really, really important to make sure we make those connections of within racial justice within the U.S. that the adoptee experience, the Asian adoptee experience, you know, is front and center and connected to what we're trying to focus on. And then internationally, in terms of colonial history, your panel today really highlighted why, you know, that is part of that history. So we have to make sure adoptee experiences and history is part of that curriculum.
Yeah.
But my question was, like, if you are aware of and can share activist groups in Korea or here in the U.S. who are trying to address like the root causes that Joy was talking about in terms of, you know, how can we make people's lives better rather and change the way that adoption is thought of or practiced, either in the U.S. or in the world. I don't know if you know of specific groups or what kind of work they're doing.
Well, in South Korea, there are two groups of adoptees that are political. One is ACT and one is GOAL. They're both acronyms, of course, and everything's an acronym in the world. But ACT is the group of Korean adoptees who were raised in the US and Europe, who are living over there, and who have pressured the South Korean government to end outbound international adoption. Now, they have also pressured the South Korean government to try to think about social welfare. Unfortunately, there really isn't any in South Korea. So getting that going, it's very hard for single mothers because they're pressured by their families to give up their babies, but also they don't have food stamps. They don't have anything that we would consider social welfare. So really, it's very difficult. So the people from that group are, you know, and then there's the group called GOAL, which has successfully lobbied the Korean government to change its immigration laws. So that's a little bit different. But we now, if I wanted to, and I don't have any desire, but if I wanted to, I could emigrate to Korea and I could get a work visa there. Then there would be a zillion other barriers, but I could do it legally. but there isn't anything that I'm aware of. I'm sure that there are really some really good social justice groups, but I'm not aware of them. I'm just aware of those two specific adoptee-oriented groups. Yeah, sure.
Are you gonna, oh, I wasn't sure if you were going to share anything. Were you going to share something? Oh, no, were you going to share the name of a group? Oh, okay. I'm like, I want to spread all the speaking around. So thank you for that question. It's a great question because I think, yeah, it's important to support work that is ongoing. Some groups, thank you for sharing those two groups. Some other groups I wanted to lift up that are based here in the U.S. One of them is a multiracial group that's mostly for political education, but I think the folks who are part of the network they do activism work in other ways, but it's called the Network of Politicized Adoptees, and they're based in, so it's adoptees, it's a lot of Korean adoptees, a lot of Asian adoptees, but folks from many different countries. They do political education like in the Twin Cities area. Another group that I wanted to lift up, which isn't necessarily trying to, well, it's a little bit of a different type of group, but because most of the indigenous children who were removed from their families were then forcibly placed into into detention centers that are also known as boarding schools. There's an organization called the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition that is doing work to really excavate that history and make sure that people know about it, kind of work towards and demand apologies from the religious organizations that were running those facilities, and then reunite people back with their families and the indigenous nations that they were stolen from. And then a number of reproductive justice organizations are regularly trying to lift up the injustices of adoption alongside the injustices related to abortion access and lack of healthcare access and things like that. So I would say start with Sister Song, which is kind of the political home for the reproductive justice framework in the US, is like another group that is looking a lot more closely at like domestic adoption and the injustice of domestic child removal and like placement and adoption, but is, you know, equally as important as transnational work. So I have two copies of my chapbook, which if anybody is interested in buying I wasn't gonna mention it since it was Sarah's event and like in conjunction with Sarah's art, but I could sell these 2 copies, or I can send you the link to order one online. Yeah. Go ahead.
I also want to add adoptees for justice, but I do want to be respectful of people's time, and we're all a little bit over time. And so if it's all right with everyone, we're going to end the panel here. And again, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you all so much for participating.
That time went by so fast.
I know, honestly, like, I would
great.
love
Thank
to like
you.
continue having this conversation with y'all, but yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.